Hello, everybody. Welcome to another video. Today it is the 28th of May. I really apologize for not uploading, but in today's video, we're going to look at a lot of substantial advances. I'm going to focus on the most recent ones because a lot of the advances over the past 2 to 3 days have been copious in terms of the square kilometer amounts that have been taken over. A lot of these pockets that have been stretching out for an extremely long time, and I've continually warned are non-sustainable, have now started to cave in on themselves. So we're going to look at the state of a lot of those salients, and that includes the area in between the Pakorovsk and Tourette fronts, and I refer to it as the Yablunivka direction. You could also refer to it as the Konstantinivka direction. But we will begin by zooming in on the Velika Novosilka sector, or more aptly put, the Kamar direction, the border between Zaporozhye, Donetsk, and Dnipro. You can see over here that the Russian forces have advanced west of Zelenopole and have taken over 3.5 square kilometers of territory. Other sources claim that the advance came directly southwards from Novodarivka and actually infiltrated through Novopil, indicating that the village is actually already under full Russian control. But what's not under dispute is that the Russians have full control over Zelenopole and that it was taken over without that much of a fight. So the unit involved in that was the 394th Motor Rifle Regiment. Here we have a video chronicling their capture of the village. You can see over here that they raised their flag. They cleared 460 houses, and they claim that a company's worth of Ukrainian men was quote unquote destroyed. So that means either killed or wounded. So that would be between 150 to 250. And obviously, I would be looking at the lower number as being more likely. And you could also see over here that there was a Ukrainian response to the Russian advances 3 days ago. So the 115th Battalion of the 110th TDF Brigade, they conducted FPV strikes onto these advancing Russian soldiers, giving us an indication that this unit is actually operating around here. At the same time, though, the Russians have advanced as well, just north of Novosilka. You can see over here from May 19th, so it's been a while since then, but the 17th National Guard Brigade, they conducted grenade drops onto individual Russian soldiers as they were advancing through these tree lines and open fields. This is also a sector where the 31st Brigade is pretty well known for operating, and their job right now is to just sort of stop the Russian advance from reaching anywhere near the southern flank of Shevchenko, because the fear for the Ukrainians in this particular area is that the Russian momentum will continue moving northwards and will eventually coalesce with the garrison in Vilnopole, and from there will be a strong enough southern base to attack northwards and directly overrun Shevchenko. But at the same time, though, the Russians are also advancing westwards through Zelenopole, an area that the Ukrainians hadn't really expected to be at the forefront of fighting up until recently, because the front line had been for such a long time centered around the Mokriali River Valley. But ever since Velika Novosilka was captured and the ridges to its west were gradually taken over, including all of the fortifications built by the Ukrainians, now we see that the Russian forces are pushing westwards, and they're not stopping at Zelenopole, most definitely. They're going to cross over the border into Zaporozhye. And the issue here, as I've highlighted numerous times, is that there isn't actually a solid line of defense, one that spans the entire width of the potential new front line that's running vertically, that can actually absorb a horizontal attack coming from the east, for instance, because you can see how the spearhead, this attack vector, is pushing from the east and will eventually cross over into Zaporozhye towards an area like Temirivka or Obratnya. There definitely are defenses over here, but you can see how they were built in this sort of crescent shape with the expectation that the Russians would be attacking directly from the south, pushing northwards towards areas that were traditionally within pretty close proximity of the front line. But due to the Russians having this inroad through Velika Novosilka and then expanding further northwestwards, that has just completely changed. The situation is no longer the same as it was. And so now the Russian forces have this unique opportunity to break through and assault an area that is not necessarily the best defended, but is also pretty close to a lot of really good strongholds and trenches that the Ukrainians invested a lot of resources into building up. And so those could actually be taken over by the Russian side and used as a vehicle for further advances. Because something that we've seen, a pattern that we've sort of noticed throughout the entire front line, is that the Russians take advantage of a lot of these anti-tank ditches and trenches when they're unoccupied and use them as routes of advance, and that's how they're able to rapidly push through certain areas. They've been doing that since the summer of 2024. But just to move on, you can see over here that southeast of Kamar, the Russian forces were able to advance, and this is from May 20th. So again, it's been over a week. We could see how the advance amounts to 4 kilometers northwards. This is a video from the Shadow drone units. So they conducted grenade drops onto tree lines and onto some of those trenches and anti-tank ditches that are located in the routes, in the direction needed to arrive at Kamar. So now, due to the continued advances around Odradny, which I just added to the map because I realized I had geolocation backing it up. I am sorry because I haven't been looking in too much detail at the developments over the past 8 to 9 days because I've been so busy with school. But just to get back on topic, the fact that the Russians were able to capture the village of Odradny and by extension, all of the villages and open fields located southwards, it opens out a route and a really huge vector located on a relatively high elevation that will be used to attack Kamar from the east. That was always the Russian intention. It was not necessarily to advance along this very narrow route through Fedorivka and then attack from the south. It was always to wait for the opportune time to push through largely open areas of the front line to overrun these two layers of anti-tank ditches, take over this one populated area, and then push westwards. And now we're beginning to see that come into fruition with the capture of Odradny being the first step. May 23rd is when it was captured. It was taken by the 36th Motor Rifle Brigade, a mainstay of this sector. They've been involved in the capture of numerous villages over here. They pushed out the 23rd Mechanized Brigade, and in the process, they were able to clear out 200 houses. And the Russian side, they claimed that two platoons worth of men were casualties. So, that could be spanning from 60 men to 100 men, depending on the size of the platoon. And we now know that there are a lot of excess areas, excess salients that the Ukrainians will not be able to sustain hold of for much longer. You have the salient over here, which largely is in the gray zone by now. And I do need to, in the next couple of days, just sort of recalibrate the state of my map to ensure that everything is completely accurate. So, once again, apologies for that. But we do know that Deep Sea actually reported on even deeper Russian advances just to the southwest of Bakhatir. So it's very clear that the Ukrainians no longer have a solid presence here, which, by the way, is a concern for areas like Novoukrainka, Zeleny Kut, and by naturally Oleksivka, which is already within the line of fire, but will be under even more pressure once Bakhatir becomes fully solid and you don't have constantly Ukrainian drones coming in and harassing the Russian soldiers operating in Bakhatir. Because once the pressure is decreased to a certain degree, Bakhatir will naturally become the Russians' forward operating base in this region and will be used as a organization point to launch attacks all the way to the Vovch River and the border between Dnipro and Donetsk in this area. But just to look one more time at the significance of capturing Odradny, now the Russians will have access to this highway, pushing westwards to Kamar and by extension to the entire Mokrali River Valley that extends northwards to the border with Dnipro from this other location. And there are a lot of really important rear nodes that the Ukrainians have been using to build up a new line of defense, to set up new artillery batteries. You have Ivanivka being an important one, Havrylivka, Novopavlivka. These will become really important areas the Russians will intend to dislodge the Ukrainians from in the coming months. But all of that can only be made possible by first clearing out the remnants in this section of southern Donetsk that still remains under Ukrainian control. And for now, they've taken over 24 square kilometers in recent days. So that is large progress. You can see that north of Kotlyarivka, the Russians captured 3 square kilometers of territory. There was this notable video from the day after my hiatus started. It's from the Black Wings drone unit of the 59th Brigade, and they conducted FPV strikes onto Russian infantry and motorcyclists. The motorcyclists were approaching the Dnipro border, coming in from the east. You can actually see here that the advance amounts to about 3 kilometers westwards. You also had a video of Russian soldiers as they were crawling, approaching barbed wire set up by the Ukrainians, and then they were struck by the FPVs that spotted them during that movement. And so now you have the Russians trickling in on foot, on light vehicles, on motorcycles, not necessarily armored vehicles just yet, but that's the next stage. And the goal is to, first of all, dislodge the Ukrainians from their remaining villages that are on the border, like Novomykolaivka and Muravka. And there is the impetus to do that both from the east, where Novoserhivka was recently captured, and from the south, where the villages are no longer at the line of contact. They've been captured by the Russians, like Nadivka, Kotlyarivka, and now the center focal point of fighting largely consists of completely open areas. And you also have the obvious goal of arriving at the border and creating holes, gaps in the Ukrainian defense line, because the defense line over here, it's not manned throughout the entire width. Naturally, it would be difficult to do so from a manpower perspective, but it would also be difficult to do it because it's completely exposed and way too close to the front line. And so a lot of these areas are just meant to serve as obstacles and are not necessarily manned by Ukrainian units 24/7. So there could be a lot of potential gaps over here that the Russians seek to exploit in order to get their foot across the border and all the way towards the eastern outskirts of Novopavlivka, which is increasingly coming under Russian fire and getting closer and closer to the purview of the front line. Now to look one more time at the Dnipro border, you can see that Bogdanivka was captured by the Russian side. The capture amounts to 0.66 square kilometers of territory, and you have the Russian flag raised on May 24th. So now, as you guys can see, that gives the Russians a forward base of operations to approach Troitske and Horikove, the final two villages on the border between reaching this area over here, where you have just this perpendicular connection between two lines of anti-tank ditches. Now, to move on to the situation just to the east of Pakorovsk. This is really notable, and you guys can see the yellow polygons indicating advances since my last video. And you can see that it is likely the largest that we've seen on the channel in a while, probably since the fall of the Kursk Ukrainian offensive and endeavors over there. So you can see that here we have nearly 9 square kilometers of territory captured by the Russians, and a lot of it was not fought over. Not every single square inch was fought over in this case. It's just that the Ukrainians held out in Yablonivka for an extremely long time. And once the situation for that garrison of just a couple dozen Ukrainian soldiers became untenable, they started their gradual withdrawal. And then the Russians took advantage of it and were able to take up their own positions. And so that happened without much of a fight, without much fanfare. You can see over here that four Russian, this is not the correct video, but there is a video from actually just northwest of Yelisavetivka here. It's from Bars 14, so they're active around this region. It's a volunteer battalion. They stormed an anti-tank ditch. You could see the map outline of it in yellow, and they were able to then use that as a route of advance to push even further northwards. So now the big question is whether the Ukrainians do still retain any sort of presence whatsoever in this extended salient. I'm just erring on the side of caution over here because I just don't have the full information because I've been out for a while. But without any sort of external proof or videos, I'm going to keep it under Ukrainian control for now. But this area is also naturally going to come under a lot of scrutiny from the Russian side. It is enveloped from the north, east, and south. And taking it over, first of all, gives the Russians really favorable positions to approach Mykolaievka and Novoekonomichny, but it also is located on high elevation that overlooks the entire river valley, the Tourette River Valley in this case, which the Russians are partially in control of due to recent movements, but also is to a certain degree under Ukrainian control. And as I've noted for several weeks now, the Russians would really be keen on uniting their fronts that are currently expanding around Novopoltavka, Popovyar, with the pushes in Malanivka, Yelisavetivka, and eventually coalesce around a key town like Rodinske to cut off the northern supply routes into Pakorovsk. I think that's the overarching goal in this region. And we're going to look in future videos at the topography to analyze that in detail. But for the time being, you can see that the Russians continue making progress in Western Malanivka. We can see the video over here from the Russian flag being raised. That was from May 27th. And here you can see just a large chunk of territory being captured. It was not captured in one fell swoop as is depicted in my mapping based on this being one polygon. I just wasn't here for the entire development of this capture. But you can see how it amounts to 34 square kilometers. That is a substantial amount in relative terms compared to what we've seen along this part of the front line over the past year and a half. So you can see that this was a geolocation from May 23rd of Russian armored vehicle getting destroyed south of Popovyar by the Ukrainian garrison, the most notable unit being the 1st Tank Brigade. But actually, recently, the 82nd Air Assault Brigade was moved away from the Sumy border and was redeployed here due to the need for a stabilization measure. You could also see that on May 26th, the Zvirobi units, it's a UAV unit associated with the 117th Territorial Defense Brigade. They conducted strikes onto individual Russian soldiers in Poppy Vyar, which is now a hamlet under Russian control. It is important because you can see there are no settlements or really any organized, you could say, strongholds that the Russians have control over north of Novopoltavka. It's just this area that spans 7 kilometers, largely through open fields. You have the ditches over here, but they're not necessarily good fortress material. But now that the Russians have a presence in Poppy Vyar, that can serve as a good organization point for future attacks towards Poltavka, which is a bit larger and is also at the helm of another line of defenses that could be overran by the Russian side. Also, Poppy Vyar is just to the east of a key paved road network, which the Russians have partial access to, which will give them the opportunity to continue advancing along that road if they so choose. So there are a lot of opportunities due to this recent advance by the Russian side that, again, we're going to look at in more detail with topography in later videos. Over here, we have the Russians advancing into the southwestern corner of Yablunivka, capturing 3 square kilometers of territory. This video is from the State Border Service Phoenix Drone Regiment. It's an FEV unit, and they conducted strikes onto western Yablunivka. It's pretty self-evident what happened. And this is due to the Russians continuing with their movement from Novoolonivka and have actually seeped into the village itself. Naturally, the Ukrainians are organizing a strong grouping of resistance to ensure that the fighting drags on for as long as possible, because once Yablunivka is taken, we all know that the natural next step is to push along these two highways and then make it into the southwestern outskirts of Konstantinivka. So here's the Phoenix drone units. And now moving on to the pockets, the salients that we've discussed ad nauseum that are sandwiched in between Zelenopole, Starmykolivka, and Sukhobalka. We can see how the Russians are currently in the process of fully clearing them out. So a lot of this developed over the past 2 to 3 days. You can see how 36 square kilometers of territory were captured. And I would say they're not necessarily under full Russian control just yet, because there may be some clearing operations in some of the tree lines located in the center of the salient that have not been completed. And that's also why I've now marked these regions over here as under Russian control. We just don't have an indication of it yet. But definitely the movements have indicated to us that the Ukrainians are no longer able to retain control of the salients. And the straw that broke the camel's back in this case was the capture of Romanivka and then also the capture of Zoria. So the Russian flag was raised in Romanivka on May 25th, and in tandem, you had a Russian attack launch that took over most of Zoria, although I'm not exactly sure about the eastern outskirts just yet. So in Romanivka, that amounted to 3.1 square kilometers of territory taken. And it is important because this served as the conduit between the Ukrainians on the rear around Yablunivka and then the forces that were operating extremely deep into the front line, about 13 kilometers deep, really enveloped through all directions and having just a very narrow route to escape through. But these Ukrainian squads, as I noted, were trying to do their best with a small amount of personnel to drag out fighting for as long as possible. In that regard, they were able to drag out the fighting, but in effect, it has not stopped the Russians from being able to reach an area like Yablunivka. All it did was just drag out and extend the process in an area located further south. And same story for this even larger, even wider pocket between Zelenopole and Starmykolivka. So here's the video from the Russian flag being raised, and I believe it was the 68th Tank Regiment that was involved in that capture. We have their icon over here. And now the next question is, first of all, were there POWs taken? I can't speak to that. I do know that if they were still there, certain Ukrainian soldiers, and they either were killed or they were taken POW, there definitely were Ukrainian soldiers that tried to withdraw during the Russian capture of Zoria that then allowed them to use this road and nearby fields to sort of connect with Alexandropol. And in the process, likely Ukrainian forces were spotted out in the open trying to make a hastily organized escape. And that's when they were targeted and killed. But as to POWs, there isn't a large amount. We're not talking about any significant number. There could be ones that you can count on your fingers or maybe tens, but not anything more than that for the time being. There just isn't any footage or any reporting that I've seen from the Russian side indicating something that's more numerous than that. And then also here you can see 20 square kilometers of territory captured. That is extremely significant. And for the time being, I'm going to remain cautious about the area that includes these two trench lines, these defenses over here, and the road between Romanivka and Zoria. But keep an eye out for it because definitely the situation could develop in those areas in the coming days. Just to move on to Toretsk, there is a short update from here. You can see that the Russian forces were able to advance out of the city, taking over 20 actors. This video is from the Predator Police Brigade, May 17th. It was an FPV strike onto these Russian soldiers as they were operating in those fields, approaching the mine station over there. You could also see that over here around Seversk, the Russian forces have been able to fully take over Verkhovno-Kamyansk, an area that's been fought over extensively for the past 3 years. And just think about that, just quantifying that since 2022, when Lysychansk and Severodonetsk were captured and the Russians made their pushes westwards, the front line has been basically stuck at the same general location, spanning about 5-6 kilometers. And only recently, over the past couple of days, has the situation shifted for the first time in a meaningful way. So you can see that the Russian forces on May 26th were targeted by the 54th Brigade during grenade drops on the western parts of the town. And we also have this video over here from May 20th of the K2 drone units of the 54th Brigade detonating explosives on Russian soldiers as they were making this push westwards. It amounts to a capture of nearly 3 square kilometers of territory, and then moving westwards, it's an advance of about 1.8 kilometers. Naturally, this means that Seversk is now undefended. There are no more obstacles before reaching Seversk, besides obviously the defensive perimeter that you see marked on the map over here in yellow. So that's going to be formidable. And you can see how the Russians are only about 3.4 kilometers away from it. Naturally, the Russians are now also in a prime position to clear out this salient sandwiched in between Rihirivka and Verkhovno-Kamyansk. I want to look at the Luhansk and Donetsk fronts over here, just sort of the border region, as well as the border with Kharkiv. Very briefly, you can see that the Russians have re-entered Rid-Kudub. You guys must remember that if you've been tracking the war since 2022, iconic town because it traded hands a lot back in the day. And then the Ukrainians took it back during the Liman counteroffensive when they took over that city. And now the Russians have re-entered for the first time in what's nearly been 3 years now. So you can see that 1.7 square kilometers that were taken over during this advance. And this is from May 26th. The Mara FPV group, they struck infantry in houses as the Russian forces were moving in. So now there's an active battle going on for that village. You could also see that just to the south of Kharkivka, the Russians captured 2.2 square kilometers of territory. This is pretty close to the border between Luhansk and Donetsk over here. And once again, the Mara unit of the 60th Mechanized Brigade, I believe it is 66 actually, sorry. And they just conducted grenade drops on to individual Russian soldiers. So you can see that there are shifts over there. On the Kharkiv front, this is interesting. You have, first of all, an advance deeper into Kamyanka. I would say that nearly the entirety of the village is under Russian control, besides some of the northern farms and warehouses. You can see that this amounts to zero point 0.9 square kilometers of territory captured by the Russian side. And there's a geolocation of FEV striking trenches and dugouts built in the western parts of the town. The interesting development is that the Russians have been able to capture 2 square kilometers, including the hamlet Stroivka, meaning that there's been a new entrance into the Kharkiv border region. This is from May 27th, and the 3rd Tank Brigade struck those soldiers as they were crossing the border and entering into houses and dugouts in this hamlet. What this means is that whatever Ukrainian resistance comes from the 3rd Tank Brigade in this area that's largely in an open field region, there are a couple of forested areas as well. This region is now going to come under intense ground assault from 3 directions. It's going to obviously have to endure attacks from directly the north, from Topoli, and then also from Kamyanka. And that could all eventually coalesce and create a solid foundation for a Russian bridgehead across the Oskil River that can take advantage of open areas and approach the next line of populated areas, which would be Kolodiazny, the Vrichanske, Bolohivka, all these areas that have not been really well prepared for those sort of defensive activities, as they've really not been involved in the course of the war over the past couple of years. Looking at Sumy, we have two developments over here. First of all, the Russians fully captured Luknaya. This is amounting to 2.6 square kilometers of territory captured. The Chimera drone unit, they conducted FPV strikes on May 19th, indicating a Russian advance over here southwards of about 1.5 kilometers. And that means the Russians are now at the gates to Yunikivka. There is a lot of Ukrainian density when it comes to drone crews and infantry in Yunikivka, but that's going to be the next Russian objective. Likewise, the Russians were able to take over all of Bilovody, and that amounts to 1.5 square kilometers of territory captured, along with about 1.6 kilometers of an advance southwards. What this means is that we have a lot of these salients that I'm just being very cautious about, because for all I know, there could be a small Ukrainian squad that's trying to drag out fighting directly on the border with Sumy and Kursk. But in the grand scheme of things, due to these Russian vectors being so effective and continually pushing deeper, it makes the chances of the Ukrainian squads remaining in the salients in between less and less likely over time. So, in all likelihood, these areas are under Russian control by now, or are in a gray zone that the Ukrainians no longer have a firm grip over. So, with that being said, we have to keep an eye out for the next line of villages that are not necessarily the border villages, but are actually the next layer. And those ones are now going to come under Russian assault as the Russians look to deepen their Sumy offensive. So villages like Varachini, Yablunivka, Unikivka, they will all be under Russian fire. So thank you all so much for watching. Hopefully the video wasn't that bad, given the fact that I've been completely out of the loop for a while, up until a couple of hours ago. And I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.